Good evening. I would like to welcome you to another session of our Krasno event series. I'm Klaus Lares. I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It's a great pleasure to see you again. I would like to point out our website to you, krasnoevents.com, where all the information you find about this fall's and next year's program is available. Our next speaker after today's event will be on the 10th of October when the Ambassador of India will come and talk to us in the Mandela Auditorium, and he will talk about India in global affairs and related issues. Our distinguished speaker today is Jane Perlez from the New York Times, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Jane to Chapel Hill. Jane and I met in Beijing, first over dinner, I believe, and then at the World Peace Forum at a semi-academic, semi-political conference, which also was good fun. And it's great that Jane followed my invitation to come here today and talk to us. Jane has had a very distinguished career, mostly at the New York Times. She won a Pulitzer Prize in 2009 for her reporting on the Taliban and on Al-Qaeda. She also won an Overseas Press Club Award for environmental reporting for her work on gold mining in Indonesia. She was born in London, but she grew up in Australia. And she came to New York, to the United States in 1972, and she joined the New York Times in 1981, a few years ago. She has covered many crisis areas in the world, like, for example, in the late 80s and early 1990s, she covered the civil wars in Somalia, Sudan, Ethiopia. She was then Bureau Chief in Warsaw, Poland, where she observed the effects, the repercussions of the end of the Cold War in Eastern Europe. Then she moved to Vienna, and she reported on the collapse of the former Yugoslavia and the war in Kosovo in the mid-1990s. In the early 2000s, she came back to the United States, and she covered Secretaries of State Madeleine Albright and then Colin Powell when they flew around the world and conducted their diplomacy abroad. And Jane Perlez was there and reported about it for the New York Times. She also lived 4 years in Pakistan and reported obviously on the difficulties, the increasing difficulties between the United States and Pakistan, and of course also on Pakistan and India and complex relations like that. Since 2012 until very recently, Jane Perlez was Bureau Chief for the New York Times in Beijing, China. And of course this is a very challenging job. She had to report on what is going on in China domestically, but also, of course, she had to report on China's relations with the Western world and in particular with the United States. So I think she has lots of things to tell us. She can really talk to us about many tales and many experiences she made in China. And she will talk for 20-25 minutes, and we will have a panel discussion. And after that, we will open it up to Q&A from you, the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jane Perlez to New York, to UNC today.
Thank you, Klaus, for that exceedingly warm and generous welcome. And hello, everybody. I have to say, I've only been back in the United States for 3 weeks, so you're a little bit of an experiment. I am going to talk to you chiefly, I think, about the leader of China, Xi Jinping, and how it was that the United States got him wrong, how he turned out to be different to what was originally expected. So I want to start with just a small anecdote. When I was assigned to go to Beijing, I went down to Washington and I consulted with the people who are considered the best in the business. It's kind of a rite of passage of New York Times reporters. When they get assigned somewhere, they go and talk to the experts. So I remember very clearly sitting in this beautiful home in Georgetown in 2012 with a former US ambassador to Beijing, a very distinguished man who'd actually been born in China, the son of missionaries. And he and photos of FDR and Teddy Roosevelt were looking down on us, and he assured me that Xi Jinping was going to be just right for the United States. He was going to be to America's liking. His father had been the right-hand man of Deng Xiaoping, who was responsible for opening up the economy of China after 1979. And Xi Jinping's father had gone down to the south and made the early moves to open up Shenzhen, which is now just outside Hong Kong, and made Shenzhen into this free trading capitalist zone. Xi Jinping's father had been persecuted during the Cultural Revolution, so there was no chance that Xi Jinping would go anywhere near going back to the Cultural Revolution because of his family background. So it was going to be son like father. And backing that up, there was a cable from Ambassador Huntsman, who was American ambassador in Beijing in the mid-2000s, which was leaked to WikiLeaks. And there was a portrait of Xi Jinping in this cable, which painted him. He was Xi was vice president at the time, and this cable painted him as a reasonable man, quite ambitious, but also an economic reformer, and made quite a fuss of the fact that he had dabbled in Buddhism as a younger man. So this was supposed to be an indicator that Xi Jinping would be a little bit perhaps more of a free thinker than what we had seen in the past. So, and then in Valentine's Day 2012, just before I shipped to China, Vice President Xi Jinping was the guest of honor at the State Department, and there was this very fancy lunch on the 7th floor, Hodding, I'm sure you know it. And Kissinger was there, and Yang Jiechi was there, the former foreign minister of China, and I was a new correspondent to China, so I was given this position right close to Xi Jinping. And he made a very nice speech, and everybody was very pleased with themselves. And then Xi Jinping flew off to Iowa. He had been in Iowa in 1980 as a young Chinese official when he was the right-hand person to the Chinese defense minister. So Xi, clever PR, went back to Iowa and met with the families that he had stayed with in 1980. As someone commented later, he got more mileage out of that trip to Iowa than all the meetings in Washington with Biden and Obama. So the stage was set for what I think it's fair to say, people thought was going to be a progressive Chinese leader. So, as expected, Xi became Secretary General of the Communist Party in the fall of 2012, and in March 2013, he was anointed by the parliament, such as it is, the rubber stamp parliament, as president. So he had his two big titles. It didn't take long for him to show his true colors. In August 2013, not even 6 months later, the party issued a document called Document 9, which said that constitutionalism was not to be tolerated, Western liberalism was not to be tolerated, and this document gave ideological underpinning to the future of the Communist Party under his rule. It was a tightening up of the Communist Party. It was going to be true to form, not loosening, but tightening up. This gave great strength to the conservatives in the party and a lot of frisson to the liberals who had hoped that Xi Jinping would be to their liking. And not long after, he appointed a very interesting man, Lu Wei, as his internet czar. So Lu Wei was unusual for Chinese officials. He was outgoing, he was bold, he was charismatic, he was a former head of the Xinhua news agency. His task was to tighten up on the internet, not to deregulate it or not to loosen it, so to say. And the first thing that Lu Wei did was to take down, there were about, 6 or 7 big celebrities who had mammoth followings on the web, on Weibo. They had big blogging, micro-blogging accounts. They had tens of millions of followers, maybe 40 million followers. And some of these people were advocating more environmental reform, more party reform, more this, more that. Looking at it from the tippy top of the party in Beijing, This looked as though these people were going amok, and they were very influential. And the thing that the party most fears is what they refer to as the Arab Spring. And these guys seem to be advocating an Arab Spring. So Liu Wei's first task was to cut them down. One of them was actually detained for some time. Their accounts were closed. Some of them have fled. One of them I know is here in the United States. More about Liu Wei later. I met him personally under quite interesting circumstances. So as 2013 progressed, Xi Jinping showed his colors in another way. He went to Astana, the capital of Kazakhstan, which is next to China. And I thought, oh, what the heck, this is one of his first foreign trips. I'll go along and see what he's got to say. The Chinese are quite good at letting you know when the leader's going to go abroad, but they never really say what he's going to do when he goes abroad. So this was going to be interesting, I thought. So turned up at the Astana University, which is the capital of Kazakhstan, and she was there in a room, I would say, about twice the size of this, not very big for a Chinese leader. And there are a lot of his traveling party in there, and there are a row of Chinese journalists in the back, and I sat with them, and there's some of his party officials lower down. And he made this announcement: we're going to do this Belt and Road project, and we're going to re-invoke the old Silk Road. And he said, I can almost hear the tinkle of the camel bells and the smoke of the fires, and we're going to resurrect that, but we're going to be building trains to Europe and bridges to Europe, and we're going to build lots of infrastructure, which sounded very good, and which is actually very good. But it was also a sign that the state-run enterprises would be let loose to go and build this infrastructure, which was another sign that the state would be more involved in the economy rather than less. I did get a close-up view of Xi at that meeting, by the way. It's always stuck with me because I got a good idea of how the propaganda works. So his head of propaganda was sitting in the back row with a row of these functionaries who had taken the photographs of Xi at the podium. And they had the photographs on a laptop. And then one of them, actually the head of protocol, took the laptop in the middle of the speech down to a guy called Wang Huning, who is on the standing committee. The standing committee is the 7 guys who run the country. And Wang Huning is kind of the ideology power. So they took the laptop down for Wang Huning to pass inspection. Which photo did he like the best? And then they decided on it, and then they sent it off. So it was a little lesson on knowing that high functionaries can actually choose the photographs. In retrospect, there was another thing that I think showed that Xi was for more state intervention in the economy, which we did not pay too much attention to at the time that it was announced. And that's the program called Made in China 2025. That's a program in which China intends to be the world leader in 10 industries: driverless autonomous cars, semiconductors, AI, various 10 other aspects of tech. And this involved pumping more money into the state industries. It's an industrial policy to try and make these industries the leaders of the world. Then in 2016, there was a very interesting decision that involved China's foreign policy. That was another indicator. The Philippines had taken China to court over its behavior in the South China Sea. And the court in The Hague ruled against China and said it had no right to be interfering in the South China Sea in the way that it was, and that it could not declare the South China Sea as its own, as China was doing. And the Obama administration didn't like the ruling, but didn't say terribly much. And the Chinese just totally rejected it. This is not legal, we're going to ignore it. And of course, they were backed by the fact that by that stage, the Philippines was run by their guy, Duterte, even though the Philippines was an American ally. By 2017, Xi Jinping was well established. He was seen as the emperor of everything. He ran the country, no two ways about it. He had a huge anti-corruption campaign going. All his enemies were in jail. The decisions were made by him. Then in early 2018, he made a fairly astonishing decision that took a lot of people, a lot of Chinese by surprise. He announced that he was going to be not only emperor of everything, but emperor forever. And he did away with term limits. Under the Chinese constitution, leaders can have 2 terms. He said, we're getting rid of the 2-term limit, and I can rule for as long as I want. So I'll never forget, as soon as that announcement came out, it came out in a rather strange way, but that's another story. I called someone who I knew quite well in academia, who was a big nationalist, who liked Xi Jinping because of the way he had promoted China onto the global stage, and was quite happy with Xi Jinping's role in the country. So I called up this person, who I knew quite well, and I said, well, what do you think? And there was just stunned silence. He said, I can't say anything. I said, I don't know what to say, and basically hung up. So that was a sign that people who had really quite admired Xi Jinping, even they were quite shocked by this. Another academic said to me, people think this is too far-fetched. They think this is going back to Mao. They don't see how it will bring any benefits. It will certainly give Xi Jinping a lot of confidence, but whether it will give the Communist Party itself more confidence, we're not so sure. So I guess you're all wondering, as I give you this litany, is Xi popular in China? Is he popular among the 1.14 billion people? Impossible to know. There are no Pew Research polls. There's no polling in China that we know of. I assume the party does some, but if they do, I'm sure they do, they don't make it public. I would say that as long as the economy keeps above water, he will probably be okay, and the penalty for rebelling is very, very strong. The economy is suffering. The growth is the slowest in about 3 decades. Anecdotally, friends, our young colleagues in the Beijing Bureau are upset about much higher rents in Beijing, and everybody in the country is upset about the sharp increase in food prices, particularly for pork and meat. And it's interesting to remember that the 1989 demonstrations in Tiananmen Square actually started on the back of food inflation. So the question of Xi Jinping's, but I think that the party has inoculated the population pretty well. Consumer life is better than it's ever been. Life is materially better than it's ever been. The millennials don't know about the Cultural Revolution, obviously, but their grandparents do, some of their parents do, and they do not want to go back to the chaos of the Cultural Revolution. So Xi has that factor in his corner. I want to go back to this guy Lu Wei, who I mentioned. He's interesting because he was brought in to tame the internet, to keep popular opinion in control. I did a profile. Well, basically he was the censor-in-chief. His job was to block websites, track social media. He organized an international conference every year to sell the idea of countries having their own sovereignty over the internet. So China's idea is, and in a way I suppose it's beginning to be an idea in Washington, I'm not sure, but China's idea was that every country should have its own internet and everybody should stay out of the way of national sovereignty on the internet. And he seemed to do that fairly effectively. I wrote a profile of him. in advance of one of his conferences. And out of the blue, after the profile ran, one of his aides called up and said, "Oh, he'd like to see you." So this is very unusual and sort of an indication of his flamboyance. So I took an interpreter from our office and went over to his fairly modest office, not far from ours, and walked in, and he was this jovial guy, and he sat me down there, and he had 2 terrified aides in front of him taking down notes. And I started to ask him questions, and he said, no, this is not for reporting. How do you like Beijing? I just want to speak to you from the bottom of my heart. So I said, all right. So I got out of there and came back to the office and said that was a total waste of time. A couple of months later, Xi Jinping took his first trip to the United States as president, and his first stop was in Seattle. And they had very cleverly arranged for the titans of the American tech industry to be presented to Xi Jinping. And these guys who don't deign to go to Davos all came to the Microsoft campus in Seattle to meet Xi Jinping. As Tim Cook said later, it was something like 2.5 trillion market cap of the people in the room. He said to me later, "Did you hear the floor shake?" Romity was there, Tim Cook was there, Zuckerberg was there, and Jack Ma and some of the Chinese internet bosses. And so about 20 minutes before she was due, Lu Wei turns up and looks at the microphone and adjusts the room, and then he goes out. Then he accompanies Xi Jinping back into the room and accompanies Xi as he shakes hands of people in the front row, and then picks out Zuckerberg, and there's a famous photograph of Xi and Zuckerberg and Lu Wei, a threesome, talking before Xi made a very brief 6-minute speech and left the room. And then Lu Wei saw me in the reporter's pen and came up and said, "Oh, we must see each other again." I said, "Yeah, sure. So that was the last I saw him, because in 2016 he was dismissed. In 2017 he was taken away by investigators. He was charged in 2018 on corruption, and earlier this year he was sentenced to 14 years in jail for stealing $4.8 million. His face in court in the very hugely displayed photographs on China Daily and on the state media was quite shocking and downturned, and his hair was grey. I just mention this as what can happen to high flyers, to people in China. I'll say just a few words now about the mood in Beijing as I saw it, given the trade war and the, I would say, nearly hostile relations between Washington and Beijing. This has given a perfect opportunity for the propaganda machine to roar ahead at full blast. The United States is really being built up as the enemy. And as soon as Xi tore up the trade proposal in May, he went to Jiangxi province, which was the start of Mao's Long March, a symbolism hard to miss, indicating to the Chinese people that we are not going to be defeated. Like Mao, who went through a number of years of hardship, we'll go through some hardship and we'll come out on top, as he did in 1949. And I think one of the most shocking things, actually, in this propaganda war that's being set up by Beijing was a very prominent CCTV announcer about 2 months ago on the 7 p.m. news, 100 million viewers. He said, the language is a little coarse, so excuse me, but I think it's worth repeating. This is what he said about the United States, and this is a well-known anchor. He said, "The US craves the whole world to be in chaos, acting like a shit-stirring stick. We will target you, we will bash you till your faces are covered with mud. We will bash you till you are left speechless." Now, a propaganda campaign can be turned on its head. Tomorrow they can say the United States is the best thing since sliced bread. But at the moment, it's very, very hostile. I would say there's a lot of fear in China at the moment. There's absolutely no open discussion about what's going on with the trade war or what's going on with Xi Jinping or the internal politics, even at universities. A couple of friends of mine who I made good friends with over the last few years say they keep those discussions to home. They don't talk about it, not even in the hallways of the university. So I just wanted to give you one last idea of Xi Jinping. It's not as though he's so remote that foreign reporters can't see him. There are always setups where a little bit more decorous than at the White House. But if your guys are coming to town, so if an American team is coming to town, of course in the last 2 years this has been largely non-existent, but in the Obama era, Secretary of the Treasury Liu would come, and Obama came of course, but high-level people would come. And so a foreign press corps would be put together. And it was always finely orchestrated so that the foreign press corps was always at the Great Hall of the People in a room with beautiful screens and of Chinese watercolors of Chinese landscape, and the room would be empty. The press would be escorted into the back, and she would come out without the guests from behind a screen and stand near the front door, and then we would waiting for the Americans to come, and he would just sort of stand there. It was always very interesting to watch him he had this sort of Buddha look on his face, and he'd stand there patiently, hands folded in front of him. Big statuesque guy, different to Hu Jintao. And then the Americans would enter from behind the screen, and they would shake hands individually, and there always seemed to be such a contrast between the emperor of everything and the Americans who would straggle in their overworn suits from long flights, and where are we now? Or another room. Oh, this is Xi Jinping. And then they would sit down in one line here, and she would be there, and then the American principal would be there, and then the Chinese foreign minister and Sui Tiankai, the Chinese ambassador, would be over here. And then Xi Jinping would do his script of, welcome to the great Chinese Republic and blah, blah, blah. And then as soon as he stopped, and before the American would speak, the security would hustle us out so we could get the Chinese script, but not the American. It was always very interesting and very telling. So I'm going to stop at that, and I'm going to look forward to Klaus's questions and then yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Jane, thank you very much for your very insightful remarks. What struck me is that the New York Times is, of course, banned in China. If you want to buy the New York Times, you can't. You can sometimes get hold of it in hotels or international companies, but it's difficult. And on the internet, the New York Times is banned as well. Did that affect your work, or was your work kind of unrestrained?
Oh, our work is constrained in many, many ways. But that did not affect our work really, but it's true. You actually cannot get the New York Times on the newsstand anymore, but you can get it on the web if you have what's called a VPN, which is a device that lets you crack through the firewall. But not many Chinese choose to do so. I'm never quite sure whether it's a matter of unfamiliarity, which I think it is, of course, for most of the 1.4 billion people. It's maybe a little bit of cost, but it's not easy to get it on the web.
And in what way was your work as a journalist constrained? If you work in the United States or in Britain or France and in China, what is the difference in your work?
Many things. First of all, China is an authoritarian country. Some of my academic friends are now calling it a totalitarian country. So anything that they think may maybe critical of them, they try to stop. So increasingly in the last couple of years, we have been followed almost everywhere we go. I mean, I think now it's become really, really, really difficult to report firsthand in the countryside, in towns, to talk to local officials. It's become almost impossible because the officials have been told to be wary of us and they don't want to get into trouble themselves. So, for example, just last month, one of my colleagues was in a city about 100 miles from Beijing doing some reporting on an economic project, and they were fine for the first 6 hours or so. Then suddenly at 5 p.m., 15 officials surrounded them in the parking lot where their car was. So they called me, and I called the foreign ministry, who's supposed to be our go-between, and they're supposed to negotiate with such people and tell them that the reporters are allowed to be where they are. I mean, officially, we are allowed to go wherever we want in China. It doesn't quite work out that way. So the foreign ministry guy talked to the leader of the 15 officials, and in the end, they left. But 3 hours later, when our reporters turned up in another city at another hotel, another bunch of officials turned up in the lobby at 9:30 p.m. and were demanding to see our reporters, so we had to deal with that as well. 3 weeks ago, China effectively evicted a reporter from the Wall Street Journal who had written a story about Xi Jinping's cousin, who it was a well-documented story that had actually been written in Australia some years before. But some new facts became clear, and Xi Jinping's cousin was involved in big gambling enterprises in Australia and was suspected of money laundering. And he had 2 Australian passports, among other things. It was a very detailed story, and the foreign ministry refused to renew this reporter's visa. And another reporter who worked on the story was given only 3 months. One of our reporters was given only a 3-month extension of the visa because of his reporting on Xinjiang. So there's a lot of pressure on it at the moment.
Thank you. A clever man or a clever woman, I can't remember, once said that it would be impossible to run China as a democracy. Such a huge country with such a huge population needs to have a strong authoritarian leadership. It needs a dictatorship. Would you agree with that?
I don't think I would say any country needs a dictatorship. Maybe China needs a strong government. It does need a strong government, but that doesn't mean to say that it has to be one man rules forever.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about the demonstrations in Hong Kong. How did they come about? How will the demonstrations be tackled by the Chinese government eventually? What do you think?
Well, I think obviously the spark was Carrie Lam's insensitivity to introducing a bill, an extradition bill that would have allowed anybody in China to be plucked out of, anybody in Hong Kong to be plucked out of Hong Kong and sent to China to face the Chinese arbitrary legal system. Though that particular spark has spread to other objections, including wanting more democracy in the election of local officials in Hong Kong. The Chinese are, of course, are very nervous and very jittery about this, but it seems they do not want to use force. They do not want to, despite what some reporting, they do not want to send in the PLA, they do not want to send in the armed police, and it looks as though they're dealing with it in a more restrained way. They are penalizing big business, Hong Kong businesses. I mean, it's very sad. They are basically trying to put Cathay Pacific out of business. Cathay Pacific is one of the world's great airlines, and China's own China Air is a second stakeholder in it. But it is flying almost empty between Beijing and Hong Kong because China is telling its people not to fly Cathay Pacific because a couple of its employees joined the demonstrations. And the Chinese government has been able to put so much pressure on the government that the top layers of the company have been changed. I think they'll continue, I think the thinking is they'll continue to do that and hope at the same time that with school back in session that the demonstrations will diminish. There is a pretty simple solution actually. They could tell Carrie Lam, the top politician there, who was their person, to get lost. They could dismiss her quietly. They could get a new police chief and start over. In some ways, it's not that complicated, but that's too much loss of face in their books, so that seems unlikely.
Thanks. Do you think the demonstrations, the protests in Hong Kong will have repercussions on Taiwan and Chinese-Taiwanese relations?
I do think that the biggest fear is losing Hong Kong. They will not lose Hong Kong. If it comes to it, they would send in forces to make sure they don't lose Hong Kong, because that would be a precedent for Taiwan. I think that's a big connection.
Thank you. The trade war. You told me you're not an economic expert. Still, having lived in Beijing for so many years, you have followed the trade war in American-Chinese relations. So is the trade war coming to an end soon?
I would say not. I think it's very difficult to predict these things. I told an audience the other night that I thought that the deal that was being rumored about of China buying some more soybeans from Iowa in exchange for something on tech seemed unlikely, because why would Xi Jinping want to help re-elect Donald Trump? But of course, next day in the paper it said that the Chinese were about to buy some more soybeans. But seriously, I think that it's going to be, if there is such a deal, it'll be small and will not be a complete trade deal. Because at the heart of it is the question of tech and intellectual property and the things that China's just not willing to give up, and which they think in which they're very confident that they can dominate, and that they can, in the end, well, maybe not dominate, but in the end, at least come to a power with the United States. So I think it's pretty hard to come to a big sweeping deal. But you know, the economy's hurting in China, and they need a deal. It's hurting them as much as it's hurting them, maybe more. Everybody has a different opinion on who it's hurting more, but it is hurting the Chinese economy. But you know, Nick Lardy, who I really respect at the Peterson Institute in Washington, says the trade war is not the cause of it's not the cause of the economic downturn in China. There are other basic factors.
So, is the trade war also about the maintenance of American supremacy, would you see?
Oh, you have to ask Donald Trump that. I don't think that. I don't know.
Yeah, all right. Tell us about the problems in Xinjiang. That is a severe problem that has damaged China's image internationally severely, and is of course a huge domestic problem as well. How is China dealing with that right now, and do you see a change in that policy?
So, just to put you in the picture, Xinjiang is a vast province in Western China. It's where they do the nuclear testing, it's where they grow cotton, it's where GM has got a small plant, it's where Uniqlo makes clothes. I mean, it's not an industrial province, it's basically huge cotton crops in a vast area. And originally it was populated by a Muslim Turkish ethnic group called the Uyghurs. In the last number of years, the Chinese have imported a lot of Han Chinese to try and equalize the population. So the Uyghurs have been very restless under the Han domination. 10 years ago, there were big riots in which a lot of people were killed. And 2 years ago, the Chinese government rounded up, basically it appears to be about 1 million Uyghurs, 1 million people are now in detention camps, being forced to make work and basically listen to Chinese propaganda all day. The goal of this being to, what the Chinese say, is to de-radicalize them, which is nonsense because there were no radicals in the first place. I mean, maybe a few men have gone to fight in Syria, but they're hardly a threat to the Chinese state. So 1 million people are in arbitrary detention. Children are separated from their parents, and there are even efforts by the Chinese government to send their officials to other parts of China to take Uyghurs who are, say, lecturing in Chengdu. I know one Uyghur university professor was lecturing there, and she was picked up by the Xinjiang police, put on a plane, and sent back. The rest of the world has paid very little attention to this. I think in part because the Trump administration shows no interest in it at all. The Secretary of State has muttered some things about how it's very bad, but the President has said nothing, and he's the only one who counts. At the United Nations, the Chinese have been very, very skillful, extremely skillful in snuffing out any debate, and they've put an enormous amount of diplomatic clout into making sure that the question of Xinjiang and the Uyghurs does not get onto any agenda. So I think they can go on doing this for as long as they want, and it's shocking.
And from a Chinese point of view, is that necessary? Are they really afraid that Al-Qaeda and similar fundamentalist terrorist groups will take over the province?
I can't really address. They say that. I don't think so. I think that they are very keen on harmonious society in which the Han dominate. And one of the reasons they can do this is that the vast majority of the Chinese people seem to support this. I mean, the liberal Chinese people who I know, A, don't know very much about it because it's not broadcast in state media, and B, those who do know something about it quietly say, well, that's necessary, we're afraid of terrorists, we're afraid of this, we're afraid of that. So the Communist Party is fortified in this policy by the acquiescence of its own people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another area of dispute between the West, or between the United States and China, is the South China Sea. Do you see that could come to an explosion? Is that really as dangerous as we sometimes read?
Explosion, I don't know. It depends a bit on the United States. I mean, how anxious is the United States to keep its control of the Pacific Ocean? There was a very interesting paper put out actually by a China Study Center at Sydney University in Australia, which looked at the powerless state of American forces in the Pacific. The Navy is down an extraordinary number of vessels. The Air Force is wanting in training. The Marines are wanting in training. The Americans are not at the top of the game in the Pacific. So I can see, and if Trump's not interested in, if he's going to say, make America great again, and it's going to be Fortress America, maybe the Americans will see it.
Mm-hmm. What do your sources in the White House tell you?
I have none.
I can't believe that. There are all sorts of rumors flying about, or used to fly about, maybe last year, the year before, that Xi Jinping's position in Chinese politics was much less secure than it appears to the outside world. Have you got any deeper insights on that, or have there been any developments?
Well, there are definitely factions. I mean, the Communist Party was built under Mao by factions. And I think that there are conservative factions and there are liberal factions, and I'm just not a real expert on his position, but I would agree that it's not as, he made himself chairman of everything forever, maybe for a reason, that this was a way to try and fend off the competitors.
We had Graham Allison here a couple of years ago, who of course talks about the rising power and an established power who may clash and go to war. How do you see that? What is the likelihood of something like a serious military conflict?
I don't really. It's very hard to tell because the nature of war, and you teach this, the nature of war is changing. It's not going to be a matter of aircraft carriers running around the Pacific Ocean on the kinds of missiles that you have. Perhaps it won't be that. Perhaps it'll be more like cyber warfare. Maybe it'll be a totally different kind of robotic kind of warfare. I don't see war between the United States and China in the next 10 years, and it's very hard to project 15 years from now. But I can say this. I think that allies of the United States in the Asia-Pacific region are very uncomfortable. They can't rely entirely on the United States. I just mentioned that the military is not up to snuff. They've got a man they can't rely on in the White House. So they're looking around in a way to build their own defenses. In Australia, for example, which is supposed to be the United States' closest ally, there is now talk of maybe we should have a nuclear deterrent. It's probably not going to happen, but it's a sign of the nervousness about whether the United States is a reliable partner. And I think Japan is also, there are discussions in Japan about the same thing. Is the United States a reliable partner?
And why does Trump not build up a united front towards, let's say, Chinese unfair trade practices, cooperating with Japan, with Europe, with Australia? Instead of that, he seems to want to do it all by himself.
Well, that's him. He's a real estate man from New York, and he's used to unilateral action. I mean, of course, it would be much smarter to deal with China with a group of allies, to have a united front with Europe, with Australia, with Japan. But it seems to be beyond his understanding or his need or his interest, personal interest. And the Chinese are very clever. So, for example, in Europe, China for a number of years now has a special relationship with 16 countries of the European Union. These are countries that joined the European Union after the Cold War. Poland, Romania, Czech Republic, and so forth and so on. And this means, and particularly Hungary, which is with Orban at the head of Hungary, as the leader of Hungary, it means that China can prevent a united front, a united EU action with the United States, even if the United States wanted it, which doesn't seem to want it at the moment.
Thank you. From a personal point of view, did you enjoy living in Beijing, enjoy the cultural life, traveling in China? Tell us about that.
I love being in China. I mean, as a foreign correspondent, life's an adventure, and it's always a great adventure in China. And there's so much variety, from Hainan in the south, which is a tropical island. There's so much history. I went to Yan'an, where Mao and his his soldiers were holed up in the late 1930s up until 1947, and then they fought the Civil War, and then they marched on Beijing. To the Dongzhong caves, in the great Buddhist caves in western China, Chongqing, which is the second largest city in China. It's an amazing place. I mean, it's on the fork of two major rivers. I think there are 40 million people there, and the energy of the Chinese people to work is also stunning. And then to go down to Shenzhen and see the tech startups that are doing extremely well. I went to one last year where they're making robots, and it was interesting because they had a staff, small, maybe 80 people, but all young mathematicians, not only from China, but from around the world. There was one guy from Serbia, there was an American, there were Australians, it was quite remarkable. And these startups can get a lot of money, a lot of injected capital, so that's another exciting part, so I like it.
Thank you. It sounds that there should be a lot of cooperation between the United States and China instead of a trade war or similar things. But let's open it up to questions from the audience, and then we'll see what other people think. Yes, please. Yes. Can we have a microphone here?
James, you talked about the arc of change under Obama, the surprise that she turned out to be. And then when we look to where we are today, I don't know whether this is what you're saying, but our news here is so Trump-centric that it's hard for us to tease out of that whether the changes in our politics here have had a material change in what is really going on in China and where we stand with China. Did I hear that right?
Do you mean does the presence of Trump as the fact that Trump is president, is that affecting the politics in China?
Yeah.
I don't think it's affecting particularly Xi's trajectory of becoming such a grabbing power so intently. I think that may have more to do with the internal dynamics in
Or
China.
his effectiveness.
Excuse me?
Or his, I don't know whether this is, or his effectiveness.
His effectiveness.
Who's
Trump's.
effectiveness?
She's.
I mean, he probably did it because he thought he could be more effective. Yes, he wouldn't have done it if he thought he could be less effective.
Do you think Xi is happier with Trump in the White House than he was with Obama in the White House?
Oh, I think the Chinese don't know how to deal with Trump. I don't know how.
Who does? Who does? Thank you very much. Holly.
How effective or not effective are our ambassadors?
Oh, I hate to say anything in public about that, but let me just
Please
say
do.
the current ambassador is former governor of Iowa, he's the longest running governor of Iowa, who supported Trump, of course, in the primaries in Iowa. And his basic claim to knowledge and fame, his basic claim to knowledge about China is that he was one of the hosts of Xi Jinping when he went there in 1980. And of course, he is former governor of a major grain producing state. He's supported by a pretty professional staff, but he's not a world-class diplomat.
Thank you. Yes, please.
The withdrawal by the U.S. from the TPP, is that one? Was that a mistake? Has it ceded the Pacific Rim to Chinese influence?
It certainly made China's job in the Pacific Rim much easier, and they were very happy that it didn't see the light of day. But I blame the Obama administration on that as much as anything. They took too long. They were negotiating this thing with Congress and with industries in the United States forever, and it was a secret agreement, and no one could look at it. And then at the last minute, they said, "Oh, let's go and try and pass it." Well, it was too late. They have as much to blame, I think, as Trump.
But wouldn't have Trump withdrawn from it anyway?
Well, they could have had it signed and done.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know the technical details of whether he could have withdrawn from it, but at least the Obama people could have put their much vaunted policy in place in time, I think. And yes, it was a big loss because it meant that America's friends were not in one big trading zone, and now the Chinese are able to pick them off one by one by one by one. So I want you to ask Kaiser, please.
Yeah, please.
Thanks, Shane. Great to see you here.
Great to see you. This is a very famous guy in China. Will you explain who you are, Kaiser, please?
I'm just a townie here in Chapel Hill.
No.
I lived in Beijing for a long time. I run the Cynical podcast, which is a podcast on current affairs in China. And James has been a guest on the show a number of times. But I wanted to ask you about the main subject of your talk just now. You talked about this disillusionment that so many of us had, initially believing Xi was a reformer, and just seeing how deeply illiberal he turned out to be. There was one piece of the narrative that's normally introduced when we talk about this, maybe that we didn't all get it wrong so much as he changed, that the Xi prior to 2012 was a very different character. It's hard for me to believe that people with as much information as we had, and watching it as I did, from 2007 when he was anointed until 2012, I think most of us would have concluded that he was going to be more liberal. But what happened in 2012, right? We didn't talk about the Borsi lie and Zhou Kang affairs, the whole Wang Lijun affair, and the supposed coup, whatever we can call it that, this bid for power by some serious political opponents of his that seems to have turned him quite paranoid. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So Kaiser's referring to period in the lead up to Xi Jinping's anointment as president, when there was a huge faction led by Bo Xilai, who was the party leader in Chongqing, the major city in the center of the country. And Bo Xilai was challenged Xi Jinping for the leadership, and in fact, for about 10 days, just before he was due to become anointed, Xi Jinping disappeared. And there's always been rumors about how he was hurt by security guards. He was physically put out of action, or it's never been clear. Maybe he just went to contemplate his next moves, but very, very strange happening, which we're all dying to know what happened. So yes, I think that factional fight probably did impact his later aggrandizement. But I think it's undecided whether he changed. I don't know that we knew that much about him. Did the people who elected him who chose him in 2008 to go into the standing committee as vice president, did they know that much about him? It's a fascinating question.
Thank you. Over there, right at the back there.
You spoke a bit on Chinese censorship, specifically on the internet, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on the information that the Chinese government chooses to censor and the reasoning behind that, and also if you have any information or sources for someone writing a thesis on censorship in China.
Talk to Kaiser. He's the expert. Look, everything is censored. So, for example, there's very little information on the Hong Kong situation. In fact, for the first 3 weeks, maybe to a month of the demonstrations, there was nothing, absolutely nothing on television or on the web. It was all immediately censored. Then, when the violence started, they saw they could capitalize on that, and they ran excerpts of the violence only. And to show how sensitive this is, I was given a going away lunch by someone very senior in the foreign ministry who's basically in charge of the information department. And I thought it would be a friendly lunch. It turned out to be a 4-hour harangue about Hong Kong and how the United States is responsible for Hong Kong. So this is another form of censorship. It's feeding the public disinformation. And so I said, so what's the proof of the United States destabilizing Hong Kong? And she said, oh, Alan Weinstein, who was head of the National Endowment for Democracy, said that the NED was doing exactly what the CIA used to do. And I said, Alan Weinstein's dead. And I said, he was head of the National Endowment for Democracy in the 1980s. What's this got to do with anything? And she just continued that the United States was responsible for Hong Kong. And she said, and you in the Western press only report these protests as peaceful protests. I said, excuse me, but the New York Times has been fastidious in reporting all the violence on both sides. And I said, have you seen it? She said, no, I haven't read the New York Times in 3 months. This is the head of information. So I'm going to stop there and you can consult with Kaiser on the nitty-gritty.
Yes, please.
Michael Pillsbury wrote a book a few years ago titled The 100-Year Marathon, China's Strategy to Replace America as the World's Global Superpower. Do you believe that they are on such a path and plan? Is Michael Pillsbury correct? Is he right on with what he's put to press?
I don't agree with Michael Pillsbury.
Can you elaborate a little, please?
I think it's I haven't read the book, but I think he has a very particular point of view that China is going to rule the world no matter what, and that they're on the warpath to do so, and I don't particularly agree with that. I think it's more complex than that. And I think China actually would like to have, in some respects, decent relations with the United States. I mean, one of the problems is that there's no diplomacy going on, there's no negotiating going on. There's just my way or the highway. So that's a big problem. I don't think that China particularly wants decoupling right across the board, as Washington, some people in Washington seem to want. So I don't agree with Pillsbury.
It's a very controversial book, though it has made
by
some
the way-
impact on the Trump administration.
And by the way, Pillsbury doesn't speak or read Chinese. He's not known as a China expert, if I can say.
Thank you. There, yeah.
Can you just catch us up or catch me up on the family situation in China? And we all knew about the one-child policy, and then we dealt with some doubt. And how big is the average family, and how prevalent is the teaching of English? I travel as much as I can, and I see a lot of what appear to be Chinese tourists. And it makes me wonder how much you can keep things under the wraps in the news. But anyway, just comment generally on the family.
Oh, I think the one-child policy was successful. I'm not an expert on this, but in general, it was successful and was put many women into terrible positions. Terrible things went on. It has been loosened up a little. I don't think it's officially policy anymore. But it does mean that the people I know in their, say, from 15 to 35, they are all single children. It's very unusual for them to have sisters or brothers. And I think now, although it's been loosened up a little bit, the economy makes couples think twice about having more than one child. Yes, it does. I mean, rents are very expensive, food has become expensive, education is free, but so talking to your question about English, Chinese parents are very ambitious, and there are fees for extra tuition and so forth. In fact, to show you a little example of the ambition, I'll tell you this little story. There was a very interesting exhibit of Picasso in Beijing a couple of months ago. It was actually, Picasso was a young artist. It was a fabulous exhibit organized in conjunction with Musée Picasso. So you're wondering, why am I telling you about this? So there are many groups of teachers with young students coming to the exhibit. By young, I mean 8, 9-year-olds. And the teachers would come well equipped with their iPads, showing the kids comparable paintings by other artists and other works by Picasso. Really very, very moving. And so I asked one dad, I said, have you got a child here? And he said, yes. My daughter just did a really difficult and very important exam this morning. This was a Sunday, by the way. Really difficult Sunday exam. So I brought her here so she could relax and learn at the same time.
Any more questions? Over there, please. Yeah. Yeah, wait for the microphone.
Well, there is a explanation going around about Xi Jinping trying to consolidate power and serve longer term than the normal term limit. And I want to hear from your thinking about it. When he became the Chinese president, he faces a situation on one side, we have this elite and powerful who basically control every sector of the Chinese economy. And on the other hand, there is a large number of poor people. And the rich and poor gap is growing. And so if he wants to do any reform, or reform further than the China used to, then he would definitely have to touch the interests of the elite and powerful. So in order to do it, if he wants to reform, then he has to be powerful enough to be able to take on the powerful and elite and to control the Chinese, not only economy, but also the politics and everything.
So what's the question?
One theory, he's trying doing that and make sure he has the power to break that line. What do you think?
But he's not reforming, so he's got the power, but he's not reforming. That's my answer.
The hope is that he would, if he become,
I think the liberals in China thought about 4 years ago or 3 years ago that that's what would happen, but there's no sign of it.
You don't think that that's the case?
I just want to go back to, if I can, I just want to go back to the question about Michael Pillsbury's book. I mean, I think that that's the kind, as I said, I haven't read it, but I have an idea of the argument. I think that's the kind of argument that is coming out of Washington at the moment, which is basically to call China an enemy. And I don't see how that's productive. What's productive about calling the second most powerful country in the world, which has got a great economy that we depend on as well, and they depend on us? What's productive about that? How about trying to do some diplomacy? How about trying to, it's not at the top, across the board. I think it's sort of very blinkered and very determinist, and it worries me a lot.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, please, here. Yeah. Can you, Mary, can you bring the microphone? No, here, to the front. Thank you.
It's a very insightful seminar that I have heard for a long time about China, especially. This is part of my interest over the years. But my
can you put the microphone a bit closer?
Okay. Yeah, my concern and question is that over the last 3 or 4 years, there's a lot of discussions on the main medium of American, expressing a lot of doubts about the democratic system per se, which is supposed to be the best value system in the whole world, but not recently. And a lot of things have happened, both in America and in Europe, do support the argument. And what do I see is that because of fast rise of China, or because of the inherent fault in the democratic system over the years that certainly it has appeared to be more stronger than over the last years. And what's the development it's going to go next 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years from here?
I mean, I'd just like to preface by saying, I think one of the best books on China is called To Change China. And it's a collection, and Kaiser's raising his hand, so I got some support from an important guy. This is a collection of essays by Jonathan Spence, who's a really very smart sinologist. I wouldn't call him a sinologist, a historian of China. It's just a collection of essays about Western people who've gone to China since Matthias, a Jesuit priest in the 16th century, right up through Rockefellers in the 19th century to Norman Bethune, who was a Canadian doctor who worked with Mao, all kinds of characters who went to China. And almost all of them wanted to make China more democratic. And they all left with their tails between their legs. You can't impose your own value systems and your own ideas on another country. The United States wouldn't put up with it, so why should the Chinese put up with other countries telling them to be more democratic? I think the point really here is what I was trying to illustrate with the story of Xi Jinping gathering power, was that the United States is actually fairly poorly informed about China, which I think is to our great detriment. I think it's quite dangerous. We need to understand it better. And by making these points, I'm not saying it's really good or bad. I'm just saying that it looks as though the United States misjudged.
Thank you. Over there to the left there, please.
So you mentioned kind of that you thought that China was a little underinformed or misinformed about some of China. Can you talk maybe how that influenced your work and how you tried to, maybe since the New York Times is more marketed towards a Western audience, how you covered Chinese issues without imposing some sort of Western bias?
Well, I don't quite know how to answer that. Can you just phrase the question again? I don't quite understand the question.
When working in China, it's obviously very culturally and linguistically different than America.
Right.
But the articles you were writing, I'm presuming, were English articles consumed by a Western audience.
Right.
So how is it that you work through like interpreters and cultural differences?
Look, I'm sure that because I don't speak the language well, I'm sure that I missed a lot. But you do the best you can, and a lot of the reporting is more or less fact-based. I mean, when you go up to the border with North Korea and you interview people about whether trade is coming across from North Korea into China, it is or it isn't, or the ways it's coming across, or if there are incursions in the South China Sea that the Chinese are making that the Americans are annoyed about, then you take the information from both sides and you try to write a balanced article. I mean, I think covering China is really, it's different, but it's not that different from covering Pakistan or Indonesia or any of the other countries.
But don't you have to give more background, because you say the American public is ill-educated about China? Don't you have to provide more than just the facts?
The American public is not well informed about Pakistan or Indonesia either. In fact, you probably have to give less background on China because it's the second biggest economy, and people are somewhat familiar with it.
Okay, thank you. Someone in the back, maybe? Yeah.
Thank you for being here, first of all. Secondly, you suggested in one of your previous answers to a different question that the United States should be negotiating more with China. What would those negotiations look like, and how would those further the United States' national interests?
I think that the United States should be negotiating with China on not just trade. There should, obviously, it would be great if there were more negotiations on trade, not just these sporadic things every 5 months, which seem to be, on Trump's part, aiming at getting the stock market to go up. I think that there should be negotiations on across the board, on military, on cultural affairs, on universities, on science, on and art, on right across the board. There should be talks going on, but they're not going on at the moment. There seems to be a kind of silence on either side, on both sides.
What about
and
these?
It's not helpful.
What about these over 100 dialogues? Have they all died?
Well, there were 100, and I'm not trying to say that the security and economic dialogues done by the Obama administration were a great success either. These were dialogues in which the military, the Treasury Department, State Department, and all the departments came together and met with their colleagues in China once a year. But that meant that all the energy was put into these huge so-called dialogues, which achieved nothing. There just seems to be no healthy way for these two countries to talk to each other in this perilous time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, please, over there.
Hi, thank you. I'm curious about, it sounds like you've had a lot of interactions with Chinese state media, and you've mentioned censorship as sort of one of the mechanisms that sort of governs that arena. But I'm wondering about journalism in Chinese context. Do you think there are any other processes or mechanisms that convince audiences in China of the legitimacy of these outlets like the People's Daily or the China Daily or things like that? Do you think there are any other mechanisms that sort of govern this process that might be, aside from censorship, I suppose?
I mean, I'll answer the question this way. Basically, very skilled journalists, there are very skilled journalists in China, but I would say almost none of them are working in journalism anymore. I did a story a couple of months ago, and it was basically about the last man standing, the last investigative journalist, and he quit his job at the Beijing Daily because he couldn't, and he'd broken many very interesting stories about corruption and politics in the previous years. But the party apparatus was so embedded in this newspaper and in their website that he couldn't get a green light for he or his team to write any stories. So it's over. So I don't know if that, but I don't know where else, I mean, and
from an audience perspective, do you think there's anything else that convinces Chinese audiences, perhaps, of the legitimacy of Chinese state media? Because obviously somebody's listening. It's not like there's completely empty ears at the other end of this. Of these enormous state media outlets. Do you have any sense of?
Well, I mean, the people chat a lot among them on this platform called WeChat, which is, I guess, the equivalent to Twitter. But the moment anything becomes quote unquote controversial or against the party interests or against what's considered to be the nation's interests, it disappears. It's censored. It's all self-enforcing.
Thank you.
Yeah, over there, yeah.
Can you give us one or two New York Times articles recently that are really interesting and enlightening, and we can look up tonight when we go home for homework?
All of them. Yours. Paul Moser stuff on surveillance state.
Yeah, that's a good, so you should look up the byline, Paul Moser, M like Mary, O-Z-U-R. And he has written cutting-edge stories on, as Kaiser says, the surveillance state and how everybody is being watched and monitored and measured.
Tell us about the new social credit system, which has caused a lot of concern in the West, particularly also among businesses who do business in China, but of course also regarding the people of China, both Chinese and foreigners. Is it justified, that concern we have?
I think so. I mean, again, I'm not an expert on this, but basically it means that people who make any transgressions that the party doesn't like, or even if you do something like jaywalk or have some very minor infraction, there's a point system, and if you have too many bad points, then you're not able to get a train ticket, you're not able to enroll in kids in school, you're not able to get your basic rights as a citizen. And it looks as though they're going to enforce this system on foreign companies as well. which is quite troubling to foreign companies. Although, I have to say, if I can be really sarcastic, given the performance of foreign companies in China in the past, I don't think it's going to stop them doing business there.
Thank you. So can we conclude from that the government is quite concerned about its own citizens? If that is so, is that justified? Is there something like in Hong Kong, a movement or protest movement? Could that develop in major Chinese cities?
Look, there are protests, a lot of protests in China every day, and they are controlled pretty fiercely. At the moment, we don't see any, and the thing that worries the regime the most is if those local protests get connected to each other and move from one town or one city to another place. That is the thing that worries them the most. You know, this to them is pictures of Arab Spring. And that's one of the reasons there's so much surveillance, is to stop these local protests becoming bigger and bigger ink spots on the map. So far, we don't see that because of the control. But who knows? I mean, food prices are up, 50% up in the last 9 months, I think. Pork, which is the basic of the diet, is being hit not only by tariffs, but, China's almost self-sufficient in pork, but they've had a huge disease problem, swine fever, that swept through the pork population, and a lot of it hasn't been reported because local constituencies are afraid to report it, because if they report it, then they lose subsidies. I mean, some kind of cockamamie system that is, there's no incentive to report it. So pork prices being up, and then people, instead of buying pork, then go and buy other meats, including chicken, and those prices have gone up. So that's quite a serious situation.
Thank you. Any more questions? There's a hand raised up right at the back there. Right at the end.
Hi. I was wondering if you could comment on the evolution of the Chinese relationship with Pyongyang over the years.
With who?
North Korea. Especially how it's been influenced by essentially the Chinese monopoly on the North Korean natural resources.
I didn't get the last part, I'm sorry?
Especially in light of how, or I guess how it's been influenced by Chinese, how they basically have a monopoly on North Korean natural resource reserves.
You mean coal, and you mean the coal, you mean by the natural resource?
And stuff like that.
Well, look, North Korea and China, despite all the ups and downs, are more allies than not, and that's the way it is at the moment. I mean, Kim Jong-un can always run to China for some help. He may not get what he wants, all of it, but he'll get some support. I mean, I think we have to remember that the Chinese lost huge numbers of soldiers in the Korean War when the United States the United States was fighting China in North Korea. And that memory is still there, and I think that's still a strong bond. And China, as long as Kim Jong-un doesn't put his missiles on China, which seems highly unlikely, it seems fairly unfazed by what's going on. What really would worry China would be if North Korea and South Korea got together and there was one united Korean peninsula, and that peninsula became an American ally. That would be really against China's interests, and who knows what they would do about that. They would do everything they could to stop it.
Before Trump interfered and came up with his own North Korea policy, Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un seemed to be estranged. They hadn't met and relations were kind of cool. So did Trump bring them together again? Is that the correct interpretation?
Yeah, you could say that, because before Trump came along, when Kim Jong-un first came to power, he had an uncle who was basically in charge of the economy and in charge of relations with China. And he purged that uncle in the swiftest, cruelest way that one could imagine. So that set the tone for very cool relations for the beginning of Kim Jong-un's time, his rule. And Xi Jinping only went to North Korea for the first time in his whole, Xi Jinping's been to every country in the world, it seems, as president. No island in the Pacific is too small. No country somewhere else is too big. When he was vice president, he went to Australia 5 times. And when he was president, he went to Tasmania because he wanted to seal a deal to get his ships to be able to go to the Antarctic. He's been everywhere, but he hadn't been to North Korea. And then finally he went a few months ago, and I can't remember, I don't think he even stayed overnight. Maybe he stayed overnight, but barely. So relations are, they've got this foundation from 50 years ago, and I think they'll remain friends, but there's by no means bosom buddies.
Thank you.
And by the way, the North Korean economy is really too small for the Chinese to, it's just people up in Manchuria who really care about that economy. It's too small and too backward for them to care about. They'd rather frankly, they'd rather do dealings with Taiwan and, import stuff from Taiwan and make tech stuff with Taiwan in Foxconn in the middle of China than deal with North Korea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Second question. You're lucky.
I lived in Hong Kong back when the Brits signed the agreement to turn it over to China in '97. There was a lot of consternation at the time. It was one country, 2 systems, which amongst the expats and many of my Chinese friends didn't seem to have much of a future in 50 years, notwithstanding what's going on in Hong Kong now. What do you see happening to Hong Kong in 2047?
I think Hong Kong will not be very important in 2047. I think the Chinese will just bleed it dry. United States is not, it's extremely sad, but the West is not going to do anything about it. And it's just going to be bled dry.
Well, thanks very much. We have perhaps the opportunity to ask one final question. Sorry, if there is someone. There is a question over there. 2. Okay, then the last 2 questions, and then we'll call it a day.
Thank you so much. So my question is that, since we all know that the legitimacy of both Xi Jinping and the specific regime is heavily built upon the economic development of China, within the past few decades, since so I'm wondering, since the Chinese economy start to decline and the inequality and dissatisfaction among the Chinese people started to rise, how do you see this will influence the stability of the regime, and how do you see this regime will respond to it?
Well, as I've tried to say a couple of times, I think the economy is the key to the future of the party, and they well know it. Just as a bit of a digression, for example, on Hong Kong, they're trying to solve the problem in Hong Kong by doing more for housing and to solve the inequality question in Hong Kong. So I think they will do all they can to try and narrow the gap between the gaps between the rich and the poor. In fact, they have a program. They've got a couple of 100 million people still in poverty, and one of the main goals of the party at the moment is to eliminate that last segment of poverty of a couple of 100 million people by 2021, which is the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party. And they're dead serious about it. I was in Guizhou province back in March doing something totally anodyne, actually. I I was trying to write about a documentary filmmaker who had left journalism, and I was trying to write an article about him as an example of someone of how journalism wasn't working anymore and how he was making films instead. And the provincial officials found out that I was there, and they came to the village where I was, and they escorted me to the train station and expelled me from the province. Why? They never said so, but I think that they were really nervous that I was going to report about their poverty program, which is it's the poorest province in China, and they've got this edict, you've got to get rid of the poverty by 2021. And anybody who comes in from the outside, why else would they be there but to maybe criticize their poverty program? So it's extremely important to the party officials to try and get rid of this imbalance.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. You just mentioned about the U.S. and China should not be enemy, and also trade war cannot be end soon. So, in your opinion, how the two countries should coordinate? What's the solution to work together?
Oh, wow. I have no solution. All I can say is that there needs to be more, it sounds very vague and cheesy, but there needs to be more serious contact.
Good word.
I think we're exhausted you. Thank you very much for coming to us and talking to us. We have a great audience. They peppered you with lots of questions, but you did a great job answering all of our questions. Thanks, Jane Perlez. Much appreciated.
So don't forget Paul Rosen.